So where does the symbolism of bunnies and eggs come from for Easter? That's what I was wondering. I wanted to dive into some of the history of Easter in this dream session and talk about what these people really mean when they say that Easter is originally a pagan holiday. I remember a few years ago, my younger son asked me something about the Easter bunny laying eggs, and my oldest son corrected him and told him how the Easter bunny doesn't lay eggs because he's a boy. So of course I had to explain to them how bunnies don't lay eggs, but then that even made me wonder, where does the history of all of the eggs and the bunnies come from? And if it's supposed to be a celebration of Jesus and the Passover, then why are we painting eggs? And of course that led me down the rabbit hole that many of us have gone down of some of the pagan origins behind this celebration of Easter. And I pretty much left it at that for the moment, but now every year I see these memes going around about Easter having pagan origins, and then you see the Christians in response to that arguing that it was always a Christian celebration. We're going to go into a lot of the ancient roots of this, and we're going to connect all the dots that we can here to really break this down, because I think it's a lot more interesting and a lot more twisted than most people realize. I've always kind of felt like there's that solemn, dark energy to the church services that surround this and the death and resurrection of this ancient Messiah. But then that's like juxtaposed by these bright colors and these playful antics that we all associate with Easter. So there's really no easy answer to whether or not it's a pagan or a Christian holiday. The short answer is that it's a blend of both. Of course, there's strong reasons to equate Passover with the celebration of Christ and to view it originally as a Jewish celebration. But Easter celebrations and celebrations of springtime and renewal predate any Christian or Hebrew practices by many, many years. There are undeniable connections to pagan practices that connect the two and show that they've been blended over the years. So way before Christianity, even before Judaism as we know it, when spring did roll around, it was this massive big deal for ancient people pretty much everywhere. You know, you get the symbolism of the long cold winter, and then after that you see nature bursting back to life. And that was a big deal for people all over the world. It was pretty much all about survival and giving birth and hoping for a good harvest, really. If you think about the Spring Equinox, the moment when the day and the night are exactly equal, the symbolism behind that, people have been fascinated by stuff like that for ages too. The word equinox even comes from the Latin word meaning equal night. Like Babylon, they had this massive 12-day Akitu festival, they called it. And that was held around the spring equinox. And it wasn't just about the weather, it was more about the whole universe almost getting a reset. And they were honoring their main god, Marduk. They had big parades and they acted out these creation stories, and that kind of connected all of their practices in one every year. This kind of all tied to the balance of the cosmos for them. And then we get into some of the complicated rumors connected to the ancient Celts, where some people say they had the goddess that was connected to spring called Aostra or Eostre. There's not a whole lot of evidence that she even existed or was worshipped in the way that some people claim, but there was this guy named Bead in the 8th century that mentioned her, and that's the only real reference that we have to her. This is where some of the most popular rumors about the pagan origins of Easter come from, and they're not really as well grounded as most people think. Many cultures across the world did look at the symbol of an egg as renewal, so we can understand why the symbolism of eggs was connected to Easter and springtime, because eggs bring new life and spring brings new life. The Norse also saw spring as important. They would honor the goddess Freya. She was the goddess of fertility and beauty and love and even war. It showed how they connected themselves to the land. When nature woke up after winter, it was usually just a time for joy and hope, and they were connected to the gods who represented all the life-giving power. Basically, the whole idea of things being reborn, fertility, the cycle of life and death, it was a big deal for spring festivals all over the ancient world. They weren't just like some big parties, they were more like agreements between the people and the earth, understanding that things had to die and rest before they could come back to life and bring abundance. Okay, so let's really get into it. Our main Easter story starts more than 2,000 years ago in ancient Judea. This was a really important Jewish festival called Passover. In Hebrew, it's Pesach, which means to pass over or to spare. The festival, which was really detailed in the book of Exodus, remembered when God freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. This was a big moment for them because when they put the lamb's blood over the doorposts, supposedly God would pass over their houses, sparing their firstborn sons from the deadly plague that hit the Egyptians. So this is where a lot of the dark roots for this come from. And this is a big part of what Passover represents. Every year, Jewish people around the world had this special meal that they called Seder, and it was to retell the story of their escape from Egypt, the Exodus. The Seder plate had these specific foods. They each had their own meaning to them. The unleavened bread, or the matzah, represented how fast they had to leave during the Exodus, so they didn't even have time to wait for it to rise. There was the bitter herbs, or the maror, which represented like the bitterness of slavery, supposedly. The roasted shank bone, or the zeroah, represented the Passover lamb to them, and the roasted egg, the bitzah, was the mourning and the cycle of life, of course. They had green vegetables, or karpas, any type of green vegetable, which represented spring and new beginning, and how green kind of represents spring and growth and regeneration. This was supposed to be dipped in salt water, which represented tears, and they had a sweet paste, or a cheraset, which represented the mortar that they used as slaves. By the time we get to the 1st century AD, Passover kind of became this huge pilgrimage where tons of people would come to Jerusalem and turn it into a really busy religious and commercial center at that time. And it was in this city of Jerusalem, when it became really packed around that time, that Jesus of Nazareth supposedly arrived. His followers started to grow, and they believed he was the Messiah, or the Anointed One in Hebrew, and he was the promised deliverer. The Gospels suggested that his arrival during Passover wasn't just a coincidence, it was really significant. So maybe he was just the right guy that came into the right place at the right time saying the right stuff. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do tell this emotional story of Jesus having his Last Supper with his disciples in Jerusalem. The meal was usually seen as the Passover Seder, but it took on a whole new meaning at this time because Jesus apparently knew what was about to happen. So as they ate, they say Jesus broke bread and he said it was his body, and he shared this wine with them and he called it his blood. It was the blood of the new covenant, which was a concept from the older Hebrew Bible, but now it had a radical new twist on it. The meal was basically set up as a new way of understanding Passover for the early Christians. Then, as their story goes, just a few hours later, Jesus was arrested, put on trial by both the Jewish and the Roman authorities, and he was finally crucified. He died at Golgotha, just outside of Jerusalem, while everyone else inside of the city was still observing Passover. So around 30 or 33 AD, the absolute core of what became Easter was the Christian belief in what happened 3 days after Jesus was crucified. The Gospels definitely state that Jesus rose from the dead, and Christians believe this fulfilled the old prophecies and offered everyone who believes in him a chance for eternal life. So they started to connect the older Jewish beliefs with whatever they seemed to observe at this time. For Jesus, or Yeshua's first followers, who were first mostly Jewish, this whole event was completely connected to the Passover for them. They started to see Jesus as the ultimate Passover lamb, whose sacrifice was way bigger than the traditional ones. They thought that this offered not just freedom, but also spiritual salvation for everyone. So their first celebrations of Jesus' death and his resurrection happened around the same time as Passover. Early Easter was really rooted in this Jewish history and religion. But we didn't see the word Easter in any of these older writings. Easter didn't come around until some of the later versions of the Bible. I just think it's fascinating how, for the first 4 centuries of Christianity, the whole thing was called Pascha, or Pascha, which was basically the Greek way of saying the Hebrew word for Pesach, or Passover. I think the word connection really shows how the first Christians understood Jesus' sacrifice, and it shows how they thought the resurrection within that original Jewish context was supposed to be Jesus. The early Christian celebrations, they weren't just a separate holiday, they were really more like a new take on the existing Passover tradition. Now this brings us into the expansion into the Gentile world, or the non-Jewish world, and the whole dating controversy surrounding that, into the 2nd century and onwards. So as the Christian message started to spread beyond the Jewish beginnings and started to reach the non-Jewish people, or the Gentiles, things started to kind of get a lot more complicated. The new converts came from all sorts of backgrounds with their own traditions and their own ways of understanding things. They had their own cultures and their own beliefs, and their own celebrations. So this led to a bunch of big questions about how to best remember the key events of the new faith. One of the first and one of the biggest arguments was about when to celebrate Pascha. So this led to something called the Quartodeciman controversy in the late 2nd century. The Quartodeciman came from the Latin meaning 14, and it referred to the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan. These Quartodecimans, mostly in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, they were pretty strict about celebrating Pascha on the 14th of Nisan. They thought this was the same day as the Jewish Passover, no matter what day of the week it was on. So they thought that this was the actual historical date of the Last Supper. But most other early Christians, especially in the West, they wanted to celebrate the resurrection on a Sunday because that's the day that the gospel said that Jesus rose. So they came up with this calculation, and based on their calculations, they said that Pascha would be the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. And so for them, in this way, it would stay closer to the Passover time, but it was still definitely anchored in their celebration to the day of resurrection. And that highlighted some new beginning for them. This wasn't just about scheduling for these people. It was really about different ways of understanding the whole meaning and the whole relationship between Jewish Passover and the Christian Pascha, showing how Christianity was trying to find its own identity as it grew beyond the Jewish roots. And this brings us into the Council of Nicaea and the standardization of the date. Around 325 AD, the ongoing argument about when to celebrate Pascha started to cause real serious divisions in the early church. So the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, who most of us know about, he wanted to unify his empire under one single faith. So he called this big meeting, which was called the Council of Nicaea, in 325 AD. I do plan on doing a full video about the Council of Nicaea because there's a lot of myths, a lot of legends, and a lot of misinformation surrounding it, but it's a fascinating history. So we can definitely expect that for the future. Bishops and church leaders from all over the Roman world came together at this time, and they talked about a lot of different important stuff, including who Jesus actually was, what his true identity and significance was. But their decision about the date of Pascha was really important for the future of the whole Christian calendar to them. The Council of Nicaea mostly agreed with the Sunday formula. They said that Easter, which was a name that started to pop up in certain places at this time, they said that it would be on the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. So that basically set the date for Easter across most of the Christian world at that time. and it made it separate from the Jewish Passover calendar. It is really important to know that this did tie the celebration to the solar calendar and the spring season, but the main goal of the council was also to create unity in the Christian church, not necessarily to bring pagan festivals into their beliefs, although the timing would later lead to some interesting cultural mixes. This is where we're going to jump forward a few centuries, and we're going to meet the Venerable Bede that we talked about before, and the first mentions of Aostra in the late 7th and early 8th century, so the late 600s to the early 700s. Bede was a really well-renowned Christian monk at the time. They called him the Venerable Bede. He wrote this big important book called The Reckoning of Time, trying to figure out some of the details of the Christian calendar, and that included when Easter should be. In this book, he gave the first and honestly pretty much the only direct written mention of a possible Anglo-Saxon goddess named Aostra or Eostre. A lot of us are well aware of how some of the days of the week are named after different pagan gods. So following that type of thinking, the Venerable Bede wrote this passage in his book. It's literally the only mention that we have of this pagan goddess being connected to this month. So it's really important to remember that the evidence for a big, widely worshipped goddess Aostra with specific traditions like bunnies and eggs really comes down to this one short bit from Bede. We don't have other writings from that time in Anglo-Saxon England or even in other Germanic areas that really talk about her. And there's not much archaeological proof of her widespread worship. Some historians even think that Bede, being a Christian monk, might have just been trying to explain where the name of the month came from based on a lot of local stories or even some of his own ideas about connecting old and new traditions. There really is no real certainty here. A lot of modern scholars think that Bede might have been picking up on real and maybe fading pre-Christian traditions, maybe related to other dawn goddesses in different cultures, because east, the sun rises in the east, so there may have been goddesses that were worshipped with that type of name around that time in small pockets. We don't really know. But the lack of other evidence is a big thing to keep in mind when we talk about where Easter traditions come from. Even the meaning of Eostre is debated, but it might be linked to the old Germanic words for dawn or shining. We don't exactly know. But as Christianity kept spreading into the Germanic parts of Northern Europe, the local word for springtime, which probably had similar roots to Bede's Eostre, maybe from the old Germanic word Eostro, meaning dawn, which also gives us the word east, started to get used for the Christian celebration of Pascha. They started using that word kind of interchangeably, and you could see this in the writings. This word connection is probably where the English word Easter comes from. It's really a cool example of how existing words for the seasons of rebirth can get attached to Christian festivals and stuff like that. I think what a lot of the Christians like to emphasize is that just because they used a local seasonal name for their celebration, that doesn't automatically mean they took over a whole complex pagan festival with all of its gods and rituals and symbols. To them, the main focus of the Christian celebration stayed on remembering Christ's resurrection. In most of the rest of the Christian world, especially in the countries that speak Romance languages, the names for the holidays still come straight from Pasca, like Paques in French and Pasqua in Italian and Pascua in Spanish. That all shows that they held on to the original Jewish and Greek connection of Passover. So then we get into the 19th century, and that was a time when people started to get a lot more interested in folklore and mythology, and things like that got a lot more widespread. And people started comparing different religions. Comparative mythology got really popular, and that led to a lot of great discoveries and a lot of interesting things. But it also led to a lot of speculation, sometimes without much proof. And that's also related to Easter traditions and where they came from. So Jacob Grimm of the Grimm brothers, famous for all of his work on fairy tales and Germanic languages, he was actually a pretty well-known linguist at the time. He noticed Bede's mention of Aostra. So in his work on German mythology, Grimm kind of suggested a possible link between that goddess and later Easter customs like the Easter bunny and the eggs, which were all about spring fertility. But even Grimm knew that there wasn't too much solid evidence for the widespread worship of Aostra beyond what Bede said and his own interpretations. This whole period also saw the rise and the sticking around of some wrong, biased ideas about Easter's origins. One really common myth was that Easter came straight from the worship of this ancient Near Eastern goddess called Ishtar. There's actually probably not much truth to that, and there's no real language or historical connection. The names Easter and Ishtar come from completely different roots. Plus, at that time, some people tried to link modern Eastern practices to old Babylonian rituals through some really stretched and unproven claims. A lot of these ideas came straight from anti-Catholic feelings back then and a misunderstanding of how history and religion actually evolved. It is important to stick to real historical and archaeological evidence and solid language analysis, not just some loose connections and biased opinions when we're looking at where our traditions come from. And that goes on both sides. So a lot of people try to make these loose connections that aren't really there, and at least there's no real evidence for them. They're kind of playing their cards in the wrong direction. But at the same time, when Christians try to deny all connections to ancient pagan practices, you also have to see that they're working from a biased perspective too. Let's keep in mind that Easter every year brings in a lot of money for the church. Actually, more people attend the church on Easter than any other day of the year. So the church definitely rakes in a lot of money from them, and they don't want people to start to question the origins of that. They don't want people to see any type of pagan connections. So there's a lot of bias on both sides. I think it's important to kind of see both perspectives, and the blend of the traditions is undeniable, but there's no reason to overstep the evidence. The whole idea of death and coming back to life, which is central to Easter, it wasn't just a Christian thing. Way before Jesus, lots of cultures had their own powerful myths about gods who died and were reborn. And sometimes those stories have surprising similarities to the Easter story. We can think about the ancient Egyptian myths of Osiris, because Osiris was a good king who was murdered, chopped up, but his wife Isis magically brought him back to life. And this whole story of life winning over death was a big deal in Egypt for thousands of years. Then there's the touching Sumerian story of Inanna, the queen of heaven and earth. She went down into the underworld, faced death, and after 3 really tough days, she was resurrected and came back to the living world. That 3-day thing is a really interesting parallel that makes you think about the Christian story. The ancient Greeks also had their own versions, like the myth of Persephone. Hades kidnapped her to the underworld, but eventually she was allowed to come back to the world for part of the year, and her return always brought spring and new growth, which is a pretty clear link to the rebirth themes of Easter. Even the myth of the phoenix in ancient times, that bird that burns and then comes back to life from the ashes, it kind of showed the ancient human fascination with overcoming death and being renewed that predates Christianity. And in Phrygian mythology even, there was Attis, son of vegetation, whose death and resurrection were celebrated in spring festivals, and that was way before Christianity again. And that festival even involved the mourning of his death and the celebration of his return to life, which again sounds a lot like our celebrations of Easter. So when you see all these ancient myths about resurrection, it kind of makes you wonder why some people are so quick to dismiss any possible connections to the Christian story. For the people who did believe in these myths, they weren't just stories, they were deep explanations about the cycle of life and death. It was tied to their religion and it was tied to their culture. So to say that the Christian story is totally unique without looking at this bigger picture of human religious history seems a little unreasonable to me. So, what about the Easter bunny and the decorated eggs and all that? In a lot of ancient traditions that did predate Christianity, the hare did represent springtime and new life, and also you could see how rabbits could represent new life. Because of how much rabbits reproduce, or hares reproduce, you can kind of see how they would represent new life, and you see them active a lot around springtime, so that's why rabbits were kind of connected to the springtime and Easter. So the traditions for the Easter bunny, or the Osterhaus in German, seem to pop up around the 16th century Protestant Germany during the Reformation. Back in 1572, there was a German doctor who wrote about kids in the Rhineland hunting for rabbit eggs. It was more like a fun story they told to kids, how this Easter bunny or Osterhaus would lay eggs in the garden for them to find. The idea kind of slowly grew, and the Osterhaus became like a springtime gift giver, kind of like a Santa Claus, but he would bring colored eggs and candy and other treats to good kids. Probably just another thing that was used to kind of teach kids to behave or help them obey their parents more. And then German immigrants, especially the Pennsylvania Dutch, who were actually German. The Dutch part is kind of a mistake, but they brought this Easter bunny tradition to America in the 1700s, and it gradually spread across the country and became a big part of American Easter. So the word bunny itself is just a cute way to say rabbit that came about kind of later. I mean, it's pretty easy to see how the hare and the rabbit and the bunny could all be used interchangeably. Now, eggs have been used as ancient symbols of fertility and new life, and even the creation of the universe for thousands of years. The symbolism of the egg is really, really prevalent throughout lots of cultures. And when I get into the whole series on dream symbolism, we're going to bring that back, because if you're dreaming about eggs, it might be subconsciously connected to some of this symbolism. Because we still use eggs around springtime for Easter to this day. So, and it's been going on for thousands of years. So there really might be deeply rooted in the human subconscious some connection to the symbolism of rebirth and regeneration being connected to eggs. So if you're dreaming about eggs, keep that in mind. The early church had no problem adopting this symbolism, and they really saw the egg as a symbol of Christ's resurrection. The hard, seemingly dead shell represented the sealed tomb to them, and the cracking open and the chick emerging, symbolizing Christ rising to a new life and offering salvation, all those things. Then decorating eggs was definitely a practice that existed way before Christianity in all types of cultures, like even in pre-Christian Europe, where they had these amazing decorated eggs called pisanki that they used in spring rituals, and they used them to honor the fertility gods. Early Christians definitely adopted this and gave it their own meaning. The red eggs, for example, usually represented the blood of Christ and the joy of the resurrection to them. And eggs also became a big part of springtime feasts for obvious reasons. They marked the end of Lent, and during Lent, people gave up things like eggs. So after Lent was over, they were able to eat these eggs. They were also able to keep pickled eggs over the winter, so it was something that they had around at that time that was pretty accessible to them. So even though the idea of a specific pagan goddess with bunnies and eggs directly leading to the main religious meaning of Easter is probably too simple and not really supported by strong historical evidence, the deeper themes of renewal, rebirth, and life winning over the darkness of winter are definitely ancient, and they're something that people across lots of cultures and religions have felt and celebrated for a long time. It's interesting to think about how these themes of death and rebirth might connect to what people saw in the sky, even. It's pretty popular. People know pretty well now how the winter solstice, when the sun is at its lowest point, after about 3 days it starts to climb higher again, symbolizing the return of light and life. If that's not where the symbolism for a lot of these myths come from, and if you can't at least admit the possibility of that, I think there's some denial there. I definitely think It's possible, at least, that these natural cycles, which ancient people definitely watched on closely, they probably influenced the stories they told about death and resurrection. And even when the early church set the date for Easter around the spring equinox, whether they did it on purpose or just for theological reasons, or whether it just happened naturally as cultures mixed and they wanted to connect with existing seasonal celebrations, they were basically linking their main message of Christ's victory over death to this really deep human understanding and the hope for life to return. This connection probably helped people accept and integrate the Christian holiday, I think, because it definitely tapped into these really strong human emotions and expectations about spring. So these days, Easter really is truly a global celebration, and it looks different all over the world. And it reflects its core religious meaning and the many cultures that it's touched over the centuries. So while the main Christian focus is still the solemn and joyful celebration of Jesus Christ or Yeshua's resurrection and all those layers of history, the echoes of ancient spring festivals, the way some languages adopted a seasonal name, the later addition of all the fun folk traditions like the Easter bunny and egg hunts, and even our basic human connection to themes of renewal and hope, all these things make the holiday rich and really complex. Even the way we figure out when Easter is, the first Sunday after the full moon, after the March equinox, it still subtly links to the natural world and the changing of the seasons. There's still a lot of symbolism in it. A lot of us don't even realize that we're practicing these ancient symbolic traditions. So after all this research, I get more of a picture of Easter. I don't necessarily see the baskets and the bright colors, but in my mind, I see more of a darker image of a mysterious hare leaping across the sky with a vast amount of deities and different figures cast as a silhouette on the sky in front of that, and all of the different origins of these beliefs kind of blending together, and how it can really create an interesting mix that most of us experience but don't consciously recognize to this day. And if you made it this far, thank you for sticking around. If you're interested in ancient symbolism, dream psychology, modern quantum mechanics, and things like that, and how we can connect all of these things to the nature of reality and hopefully lead to a better understanding of humanity, definitely subscribe to my page. Hit me up if you have any requests for deep dives. These are my dream sessions, but I also do live dream streams, and you can join in and we'll do live Q&As on some of these topics. And I think integrating ancient practices and understandings with modern practices and understandings is really the way to bridge the gap for us as humans and really to discover our deepest selves. I think it's important to keep everything evidence-based, but we can't be afraid to dream at the same time. So if you're interested in any of that, come dream with me over on my page, and we can definitely break down some of these concepts farther. Peace and love. Thank you, people.